The year was 431 BC, and in the theatre of Dionysus, beneath the shadow of the Acropolis, 5,000 Athenian citizens sat transfixed as actors in elaborate masks gave voice to humanity's darkest impulses. The air hung thick with incense and the metallic scent of sacrifice, while somewhere in the orchestra, a woman's voice rose above the chorus like a blade against stone. "I shall kill my children with my own hand." The audience knew this was no mere theatrical flourish. They were witnessing Euripides' Medea, a play that would crystallize forever the image of maternal love transformed into something monstrous, something that could only be born from the deepest wells of betrayal. What they could not know was that this single performance would echo through millennia, becoming the definitive portrait of how betrayal can transform the most sacred bonds into instruments of the most unspeakable revenge. In the mythology that predates Homer's epics, Medea emerges from the mist-shrouded kingdom of Colchis, where the Black Sea meets the Caucasus Mountains in a landscape that ancient Greeks considered the very edge of the civilized world. Here, beneath skies that seemed perpetually overcast with the smoke of sacrificial fires, she was born into a lineage that traced its bloodline to Helios, the sun god himself. Her grandfather was the Titan who drove the chariot of the sun across the heavens, yet Medea's destiny lay not in light, but in the shadows of pharmakia, the dark arts of poison, healing, and transformation that made her both revered and feared throughout the ancient world. The historian Apollonius of Rhodes, writing in the 3rd century BC, described her homeland as a place where the earth exhales vapors of death, and the very stones whisper of ancient curses. This was no ordinary princess. She was a priestess of Hecate, goddess of crossroads and magic, trained from childhood in the manipulation of natural forces that could either heal or destroy. Her hands, which would one day cradle her own children before snuffing out their lives, were first stained with the blood of sacred rituals performed in groves where no ordinary mortal dared to tread. The arrival of Jason and his Argonauts in Colchis around 1300 BC marked the beginning of a love story that would become mythology's most cautionary tale about the collision between passion and betrayal. Jason, the golden-haired prince of Iolcus, had come seeking the golden fleece, that legendary ram's skin that hung in a grove sacred to Ares, guarded by a dragon that never slept. But King Aeetes of Colchis, Medea's father, had no intention of surrendering his greatest treasure to these Greek interlopers. He set Jason 3 impossible tasks: to yoke fire-breathing bulls with bronze hooves, to sow dragons' teeth in a field and defeat the armed warriors that would spring from the earth, and finally to lull the sleepless dragon that guarded the fleece itself. These were labours designed to kill, conceived by a king who had already seen too many heroes' bones bleaching in his kingdom's unforgiving soil. Yet as Jason stood before the palace of Colchis, his bronze armour gleaming in the alien light of a foreign sun, Medea watched from her tower window and felt the first stirrings of a love that would ultimately prove more destructive than any dragon's flame. The classical scholar Mary Beard observes that Medea's love for Jason represents the ancient world's understanding of passion as a form of temporary madness, a divine affliction that strips away reason and moral restraint. When Aphrodite's golden arrow struck Medea's heart, it was not merely romantic love that bloomed, but a form of obsession that would drive her to betray everything she had known. She gave Jason the magical salve that would protect him from the bull's fire, the strategy that would allow him to defeat the earthborn warriors, and the enchantment that would put the sleepless dragon into its first slumber in centuries. But her betrayal went deeper than mere assistance. She turned her back on her family, her people, and her gods to follow a man who had spoken to her of love beneath the cypress trees of her father's garden. When Jason's ship, the Argo, slipped away from Colchis in the pre-dawn darkness, Medea stood at its prow like a living figurehead, the golden fleece wrapped around her shoulders, and her younger brother Absyrtus at her side. She had stolen not only her father's greatest treasure, but also the heir to his throne, a child whose innocent presence would soon become the instrument of her first descent into fratricide. The journey back to Greece became a nightmare of pursuit and desperation, as King Aet's fleet gave chase across the storm-tossed waters of the Black Sea. Medea, realizing that their ship's superior speed was not enough to guarantee escape, made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her days. She murdered her brother Absyrtus, dismembering his body and casting the pieces into the sea behind them, knowing that her father would be compelled to stop and gather the scattered remains for proper burial. The historian Apollodorus records that the waters turned red with royal blood, and the gulls that followed the ships began to cry with voices like human children. This was Medea's first infanticide, though the victim was not her own child, but her father's son. A boy whose only crime was being born into a family marked by divine curses and mortal ambitions. As she watched the pieces of her brother sink beneath the waves, Medea crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. She had learned that love could justify any atrocity, that the preservation of her chosen future was worth any sacrifice of blood or innocence. The years that followed in Iolcus should have been a time of happiness and security, but the seeds of tragedy had already been planted in soil watered with fraternal blood. Jason's uncle Peleus, the usurper who had driven Jason's father from the throne, still lived and ruled, his very existence a constant reminder that Jason's heroic quest had not yet achieved its ultimate purpose. Medea, now a wife and mother to 2 sons, found herself trapped in a Greek world that viewed her as a barbarian sorceress, an exotic prize that reflected well on Jason's heroic reputation, but could never truly belong to Hellenic civilization. The Roman historian Seneca, writing centuries later, observed that Medea's tragedy began not with her crimes, but with her displacement. She was a woman caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Her magic, which had saved Jason's life and secured his glory, became a source of suspicion and fear among the Greeks, who whispered that she practiced dark arts learned in the savage lands beyond the Bosphorus. Even as she bore Jason's children and attempted to fulfill the role of a Greek wife, she remained forever foreign, forever other, forever watching her husband's eyes grow distant as he began to see her not as his beloved, but as a reminder of debts he preferred to forget. The final betrayal came not with the clash of swords or the fury of battle, but with the quiet, calculated cruelty of political ambition. Creon, king of Corinth, had a daughter named Glaus, young and beautiful, and most importantly, Greek. When he offered her to Jason as a bride, along with the promise of succession to the Corinthian throne, the hero who had once sworn eternal love to Medea did not hesitate. The historian Diodorus Siculus records that Jason justified his decision by claiming that a hero must consider not only his heart, but his legacy, and what inheritance can a barbarian woman provide for his sons? This was the ultimate insult. Not only was Medea being cast aside for a younger woman, but her own children were being deemed unworthy of their father's name and fortune. The woman who had sacrificed her family, her homeland, and her innocence for love was being discarded like a worn-out cloak, her years of devotion reduced to nothing more than an embarrassing chapter in Jason's heroic biography. The ancient sources describe Medea's reaction to this betrayal in terms that prefigure our modern understanding of psychological breakdown. She neither ate nor slept, spending her days weeping and her nights pacing the halls of her house like a caged lioness. Her servants whispered that she spoke to invisible presences, conducting long conversations with the spirits of her ancestors or the gods of her homeland. But beneath the surface of this apparent madness, a more terrible clarity was taking shape. Medea began to understand that there was only one way to inflict upon Jason a pain equal to what he had inflicted upon her. She must destroy what he valued most, and what he valued most was not her, but the sons she had borne him. The 5th century playwright Euripides captures this moment of realization with chilling precision. I understand the evil I am about to do, but my passion is stronger than my reason, passion that causes the greatest suffering among mortals. The wedding day dawned bright and clear over Corinth, a day when the whole city celebrated the union of their king's daughter with the famous hero of the Golden Fleece, But in her darkened house, Medea was preparing gifts for the bride, a golden coronet and a flowing robe, both crafted with the same skill that had once created the magical salve that protected Jason from the fire-breathing bulls. These were not gifts of congratulation, but instruments of revenge, soaked in poisons that would burn flesh from bone and consume their victim in flames that could not be extinguished. When the unsuspecting Glaucer placed the coronet upon her head and wrapped the robe around her shoulders, she was transformed in moments from a blushing bride into a living torch, her screams echoing through the palace as she collapsed in agony. King Creon, rushing to save his daughter, embraced her burning form and was himself consumed by the magical fire, father and daughter dying together in an embrace that fused their flesh into an unrecognizable mass of charred bone and melted gold. But even as the smoke from the royal palace rose into the Mediterranean sky, Medea knew that her revenge was not yet complete. The death of Jason's new bride and her father would cause him pain, but it would also make him a figure of sympathy, a hero wronged by a vengeful sorceress. To truly destroy him, she had to go further. She had to attack the very essence of his identity as a father and protector. Her sons, playing in the garden outside their house, were beautiful children who carried their father's golden hair and their mother's dark eyes. They were innocent of their parents' crimes, guilty of nothing more than being born into a story that had been written in blood long before their birth. As Medea watched them laugh and play, she felt the last vestiges of her humanity warring with the cold logic of her revenge. The ancient sources differ in their accounts of the final act, but all agree on its essential horror. Some claim that Medea killed her children quickly, with a sword thrust to the heart that ended their lives before they could fully understand what was happening. Others describe a slower death, poison administered in their evening meal that gave her time to watch them die, while explaining what she was doing and why. The historian Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century AD, suggests that Medea's method was less important than her state of mind. She killed, not in rage, but in a kind of terrible clarity, each moment of her children's dying carefully observed and remembered. What remains consistent across all versions is the image of a mother cradling her sons' bodies, her tears mixing with their blood as she prepared to flee Corinth in a chariot drawn by dragons sent by her grandfather Helios. This was not the random violence of madness, but the calculated cruelty of a woman who had learned that the deepest wounds are inflicted not on enemies, but on those we claim to love. The aftermath of Medea's infanticide sent shockwaves through the ancient world that reverberated for centuries. Jason, arriving home to find his sons dead and his wife vanished, was left to face the full weight of his betrayal's consequences. The hero, who had once been celebrated throughout Greece for his courage and cunning, was now a broken man, haunted by the knowledge that his own actions had led to the deaths of innocent children. Ancient sources describe him as wandering from city to city, no longer welcome in the halls of kings, his name becoming synonymous not with heroic achievement, but with the terrible price of faithlessness. The historian Plutarch records that Jason eventually died alone in Corinth, crushed beneath a piece of the rotting hull of the Argo as he slept in its shadow. A pathetic end for a man who had once sailed with the gods' blessing to the ends of the earth. But Medea's story did not end with her flight from Corinth. The ancient sources trace her subsequent journey to Athens, where she married King Aegeus and bore him a son, only to be exiled once again when she attempted to poison the young Theseus. From there, she appears in various myths and legends, always as a figure of dangerous power, a woman whose knowledge of poisons and magic made her both valuable and terrifying to those who encountered her. The historian Strabo suggests that Medea became a symbol of the price of survival in a world where women had no power except what they could seize through cunning and violence. Her infanticide was not an isolated act of madness, but the logical conclusion of a life spent learning that love was weakness, that trust was folly, and that the only way to avoid being destroyed by others was to destroy them first. The legacy of Medea's infanticide extends far beyond the ancient world, becoming a touchstone for understanding the psychology of betrayal and revenge. Modern scholars have interpreted her story as everything from a cautionary tale about the dangers of female rage to a proto-feminist narrative about a woman driven to extremes by patriarchal oppression. The psychiatrist Carl Jung saw in Medea an archetype of the terrible mother, the nurturing feminine principle transformed into its opposite through trauma and betrayal. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her story is how it reveals the thin line between love and hate, between protection and destruction, between the impulse to preserve and the urge to annihilate. Medea loved her children enough to kill them, choosing to end their lives rather than allow them to live in a world where they would be forever marked as the sons of a discarded barbarian woman. The archaeological evidence from ancient Corinth paints a picture of a city that lived in the shadow of Medea's curse for generations after her departure. Excavations have revealed numerous votive offerings left at the tomb of her children, suggesting that the citizens of Corinth continued to fear the dead prince's spirits long after their mother had vanished. The historian Maria Tatar notes that Medea's infanticide became the template for countless later stories of mothers who kill their children, but none of these subsequent tales have ever matched the original's combination of psychological complexity and mythic power. The children's tomb became a pilgrimage site for women struggling with their own feelings of betrayal and abandonment, a place where they could commune with the spirits of innocent victims, while perhaps understanding something of the terrible clarity that had driven their mother to murder. The most chilling aspect of Medea's story may be its suggestion that infanticide was not an act of madness, but of supreme rationality. In a world where children were extensions of their father's power and legacy, killing Jason's sons was the most effective way to destroy him completely. By murdering her own children, Medea ensured that Jason's bloodline would not continue, that his name would be associated forever with death rather than heroic achievement, and that he would spend the rest of his life knowing that his betrayal had led directly to the destruction of everything he held dear. The ancient playwright Seneca understood this when he wrote, "Medea's revenge was perfect because it was irreversible. She had found a way to inflict a wound that could never heal, to steal something that could never be recovered." In the end, Medea's infanticide stands as perhaps the most horrifying example of how betrayal can transform love into its opposite, how the deepest intimacy can become the weapon of the deepest revenge. Her story reminds us that the capacity for evil does not exist in isolation, but grows from the same soil that nurtures our capacity for devotion and sacrifice. The woman who had once risked everything to save the man she loved became the woman who would destroy everything to punish him for abandoning her. In the mythology of ancient Greece, where gods and mortals alike were subject to the inexorable laws of fate, Medea's infanticide represents something even more terrifying than divine wrath. It represents the moment when human love becomes indistinguishable from human hatred, when the maternal instinct to protect becomes the compulsion to destroy. And in that moment of terrible transformation, when Medea's hands moved from caressing her children to ending their lives, she crossed a threshold beyond which even the gods could not follow. She had become something that was neither human nor divine, but something else entirely. A mother who had learned that the ultimate expression of love might be the willingness to kill what you cannot bear to lose,